Okay, so in this video and the next two videos of this detailed Edexcel A-Level Politics essay writing course on the Politics Explained YouTube channel, we're going to have a look at how to answer political ideas questions. So these are the 24 markers that you get both in your first exam on core political ideas, liberalism, socialism and conservatism, and also in your second exam on your non-core ideology. As with the rest of this course, the PDFs that you can see on your screen in this video and the next two videos, you can get for free on the Politics Explained website, where you can also find loads of other free and paid resources to help you in your politics A-level, including some free mocks to help you before this year's exams, loads of essay plans, updated textbooks to really prepare you for those exams, a place to sign up for tutoring or some revision webinars we're running before this year's exams if you're interested, and loads else as well. Yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. So this first video on core political ideas is going to have a look at the different structure of political ideas questions. So make sure you've had a look at the 30 markers and the source question videos first, and now we're going to go on to political ideas. So your answers to political ideas questions are marked using exactly the same assessment objectives. So you're marked using AO1, knowledge, AO2, analysis, and AO3, evaluation. And just like 30 mark questions, they ask you to consider and compare two sides of an argument and come to an overall judgment, have a very clear judgment in relation to the question. But the difference is they're phrased differently and have a different focus. So every question starts with to what extent, and will be focused on how much agreement there is within the ideology. So for the core political ideas, that's liberalism, conservatism, and socialism. So they're asking you to what extent is there agreement on a particular area of that ideology, or it might be overall. So you're asked to compare the ways in which they disagree, the ideology disagrees, and the different strands within it disagree, and the areas in which they agree, and come to a judgment about to what extent they agree and which is more important. So the questions will often be focused on either human nature, the state, society, or the economy. So it could be to what extent do liberals agree on human nature, to what extent are conservatives united in their views on the state, to what extent do socialists fundamentally disagree about capitalism. You could also get more general questions, so to what extent do liberals agree, to what extent do conservatives agree, to what extent do socialists agree, or highlighting just a couple of those strands, so to what extent does the new right and traditional conservatives agree, to what extent does revolutionary socialism and social democracy agree. So they're the kind of overall questions where you're going to bringing in things from across state, society, economy, and human nature. And the final type of question you can get on core principles or ideas of that ideology. So you could be asked about liberalism in relation to liberty or freedom. To what extent do liberals agree on liberty or agree on freedom? Individualism, rationalism, tolerance, fear of the state, liberal democracy, and equality, for example. Same with conservatism, you could get asked about pragmatism, tradition, human imperfection, or paternalism. For socialism, social class, equality, common humanity, workers' control, and collectivism. Of course, there are those core principles for the non-core ideologies that you can get asked about as well. So that's the different structure of the question. Again, you're very much looking at two sides of an argument and coming to an overall judgment in exactly the same way as those 30 markers. It's just that the two sides of the argument in this are ways in which the strand agree, really key ways they agree, key ways that they disagree, and your judgment is going to come to a judgment about, okay, to what extent do they agree? Are we going to say they agree to a large extent or they disagree to a large extent? So in terms of the content you need to include then, so in your essay there needs to be a focus on the different strands within an ideology and the thought of key thinkers. So you need to mention at least two key thinkers in your essay. I really recommend trying to use at least 3 or 4 though in every essay. And the next video, or not next video, the video after, we're going to have a look at how you need to be really kind of strand-led, not thinker-led, but effectively you need to compare the strands within an ideology, what they think about something. So do the strands disagree? Where do the strands disagree? Where do the strands agree? And also bring in thinkers. And crucially, it needs to be strand-led, so really based around the disagreement or agreement between the strands, and then the thinkers are then examples of those strands. You've got here the key strands and key thinkers for liberalism, conservatism, and socialism. As I mentioned, you have to use at least 2 in your essay, but I really recommend trying to get in at least 4 of these key thinkers in every ideology's essay that you are writing. Key things to keep in mind then is that you should make sure to think and structure your answer in terms of clear points of agreement and disagreement within the ideology. And crucially, as with every question, make sure it's focused on the question. If it's asking you about to what extent do socialists agree on human nature, don't go in don't introduce a disagreement about the state. Of course, your disagreement about human nature might involve the state or involve the economy, but it really needs to be focused on it. So it might be, for example, socialists disagree on the extent to which human nature is positive under capitalism. So that links into the economy, but it's still very much focused on the question on human nature. So focus your answer around very clear points of agreement or disagreement within the ideology and between the strands, and don't do separate paragraphs on each strand. This is the biggest thing. Don't do one paragraph on revolutionary socialism, one paragraph on social democracy, and one paragraph on the third way, because you might pick up good marks for AO1, but you'll pick up very few marks for AO2 analysis and AO3 evaluation, because you're not going to be comparing the extent of agreement or disagreement between the strands, and therefore your judgment is going to be really, really poor. Your points need to be strand-led, not thinker-led. So the disagreements are between the strands, not thinkers, and the agreements between the strands, not thinkers. The thinkers are then used as examples of the strands. That's a really important thing. The Edexcel exam would have come out very clearly and said. And an important thing to recognise as well, the agreements and disagreements don't have to be on completely separate things. There will often be broad agreement on a principle, for example, freedom and liberalism. That's a really important agreement, even though there's some specific differences within it. And just because there's specific differences between the strands on exactly how they interpret freedom, it doesn't mean you can't also bring in freedom as an agreement. So they can be on the same things. You can have, they agree on freedom. Overall, this freedom is a driving principle for both of them. This is how it happens. Then you could also have a disagreement paragraph on how they disagree on exactly how they interpret it says liberalism there, but it's exactly on how they interpret freedom or interpret liberty or any of these core principles. And that's really important. That can really aid your judgment as well, because it's not like they're going to be completely distinct agreements and disagreements. They're going to agree in some ways, but disagree within that in some ways. And you need to judge which of those is the most important in your evaluation, in your overall judgment. And therefore, often the agreements are going to be on the same things as the disagreements. Of course, it will be the ways they agree for the agreement paragraph and the more specific ways they disagree for the disagreement paragraph. But don't think that you can only do an agreement on something where there's complete agreement on it, where there's never any kind of differences within the ideology, because you're ultimately going to have very few points if you try to do that. The final thing then is that though you should try to do so if possible and include all of the strands at some point in an essay. So you have to include every strand at some point in your essay. That's absolutely you have to do. Any agreement paragraph or disagreement paragraph you do, though, doesn't have to include every strand. So you should try, if possible, to try and include all, if there's three, for example, socialism, all three strands in the agreement paragraph or disagreement paragraph. They don't have to. You could do, for example, a disagreement paragraph just between two of the strands, or an agreement just focusing on two of the strands. And you'll see that if you look at the webinar I've done for this year on core political ideas. I've got a lot of essay plans in there that really demonstrate that. How then to structure political ideas answers? So as there are only 24 marks and you have around 30 to 35 minutes to complete them, your answer is going to be shorter than the 30-mark source and essay questions. And crucially, there are a number of different structures teachers recommend for answering ideologies questions, and a lot of them are good. So I've got three here that we go through. So we very much recommend the first structure. I really recommend going with the first structure, as I think it works for every question and comes to a really effective answer to hit those top marks for every question. But the other two are good as well. And if you're confident with one of these, then stick with it. So all of the below, of course, also have an introduction and a conclusion. So the key one that I recommend is one, and this is what most teachers are recommending now, is one paragraph on agreement and two on disagreement, or vice versa. So it could be two on disagreement and one on agreement. And crucially, so you're coming one paragraph on key areas of agreement within the ideology, selecting a particular point and how they agree in relation to the question, and then two paragraphs on areas that the strands disagree when you're comparing them, or vice versa. So two on agreement and then one on disagreement. The reason I like this is it works well for every single question. You're always going to be able to find one agreement or two disagreements for every one agreement or one disagreement, and two of the other side for every answer you're going for. And that's maybe the problem I have with this third structure. Slightly, it doesn't work for every question, because sometimes there aren't going to be two big agreements or two big disagreements, and that might result in you repeating yourself, and you don't do that with this first structure, which is why I ultimately recommend this, and why the essay plans on the website are structured in these terms. Unlike the 30-mark essays, each of these main paragraphs is focused just on one side of the argument. So it's not for or against within the paragraph or agreement versus disagreement within the paragraph. It's just agreement. And therefore, they don't have a mini conclusion. And what that means is that you need to add more evaluation, more detail to your judgment, to your introduction and in conclusion to make sure you're picking up enough evaluation AO3 marks. And I recommend always starting with an agreement paragraph because often that will be more general and disagreement will be more specific, and it often just makes a lot more sense. As I always start with that with an agreement paragraph. The other one you can do is effectively very similar to this that some people do, and I think this is really good if you struggle with political ideas or you struggle with your timings, and that's just do one paragraph on agreement and one on disagreement. Of course, you're covering kind of one fewer point than the first structure we had a look at, but it can kind of really simplify it, and you can still do really, really well with this structure. Again, unlike the 30-mark essays, it doesn't have mini conclusions, so add more evaluation to that introduction and that conclusion, and start with the agreement paragraph. The final structure then I've seen quite a few teachers recommending is doing effectively similar to the 30-mark essays, 2 paragraphs of agreement versus disagreement and a mini conclusion at the end. So 2 of those. I think this can be really good for some questions, especially broader questions. And if you're confident in it and been practicing it for a while, can do it well, definitely stick with it. Don't stick to the structure that I recommend. The reason I don't recommend it is that for me it doesn't work well for quite a few questions, as for sometimes there's only one big core agreement or one big core disagreement within the ideology, and that means that if you force yourself to do 2 because you've got these 2 agreement versus disagreement paragraphs, it can lead to repetition in that second paragraph or points that don't directly answer the question because you're trying to find another point when there might not be one. It would have been, for me, it's better to just do 1 agreement and 2 disagreements if that's the case, and have that agreement in more detail explaining that 1 agreement, or vice versa if it's the disagreement, of course. So yeah, I think this can definitely work if you're confident in it, particularly for broader questions where you can bring in more things. It can work really well. So to what extent do Liberals agree, to what extent do Conservatives agree, comparing to what extent do the New Right agree with traditional Conservatives, for example. I think it can be really good. But for some of the more specific questions on human nature, society, the state, or some of the principles, I think sometimes it falls short and you're kind of too short of points to make this the most effective structure. Crucially, what I would say is that I've seen some tutoring students where the teachers are recommending doing this with 3 paragraphs, so 3 lots of agreement, disagreement, mini conclusion. Don't do that. You just don't have enough time to do that, and inevitably, if you try and do that, there's not enough points to do that for almost every question. B, you're inevitably not going to have enough time. You're going to sacrifice detailed explanation. Because you're going to get the points, but you're not going to explain them enough because you just don't have time. And that detailed explanation is really key to doing well in these ideologies essays, whether explanation of an agreement or explanation of particular strands. So I wouldn't recommend doing that. If you're going to do agreement versus disagreement mini conclusion paragraphs, just do 2 of them with an introduction and a conclusion. So yeah, hopefully that was helpful. We're going to go on now to having a look first in the next video at evaluation in political ideas questions, and in the video after that at AO1 and AO2, so the main paragraphs and how to write those.